This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. India and Iran have deep cultural and historical connections, but relations between the two nations have been complex in the post-colonial era. Iran is important for India both as an energy source and as an access point for markets in Central Asia, especially with India's investments in the Chabahar port. But following US sanctions on Iran over its nuclear program, India has had to curtail whatever engagements it has had with the country. More recently, however, there has been somewhat of an uptick in relations. Iran has offered visa-free travel to Indian tourists, while India was instrumental in getting Iran into BRICS. At the same time, the war in Gaza that broke out on October 7th and the attack of the Iran-backed Houthis on commercial shipping in the Red Sea has added another dimension of complexity. What are the key concerns and objectives for Iran and for India when it comes to bilateral engagement? To what extent does American, Israeli, and Arab concerns influence India's approach to Iran? And what outcomes should India be aiming for through its engagement with this country? We discuss all these questions in detail in this episode, and we are joined by Mr. M.K. Bhadrakumar, a strategic analyst and former diplomat who has served in Iran. Mr. Kumar, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to In Focus.
Thank you, Mr. Sampath. It's a pleasure, working with you on a program of this nature. And Hindu has a great tradition of being very profound in intellectual terms, which is hard to come by in the Indian media. So I take this as a splendid opportunity for reaching out to an audience which is cerebral and thoughtful in our country.
Thank you, Mr. Kumar. Thank you for your kind words.
As far as your remarks are concerned, can I get into it? As far as your remarks are concerned, it's a multidimensional presentation that you gave in the beginning. Where do I start? We can probably, thread our way through the various templates. So, I can give you a few remarks initially. India-Iran relationship was of a certain kind through the Cold War era, right up to 1979, during the Shah's regime. It was a very different kind of a relationship, and Iran was very different. Iran's policies were different. This is very fundamental importance. And then the Islamic Revolution came. And the Islamic Revolution initially created a certain sense of consternation in India, because it's the first time that we were encountering political Islam in the neighborhood, getting entrenched. So it was surprising, and I think it goes to the credit completely of Indira Gandhi that she understood the moorings of the revolution in Iran. And we had a wonderful ambassador there by name Akbar Khalili at that time, who interpreted the revolution. And we have very rich archives on Iran in the foreign ministry. And some of the dispatches, that he had written probably, would never be written again in the Indian archives, So I was at that time looking after Iran also, and I had access to his cables and everything. He interpreted the revolution, and I'm completely in sync with it, in terms of Iranian nationalism. Actually, it's a paradox that except for the content of religion, the moorings of the revolution, the inspiration for the revolution, they are actually quite comparable with India's freedom struggle. Though there was no explicit colonial rule as such, Iran was controlled by the West. And in terms of particularly the Iran British presence there in terms of the oil, extraction and so on, controlling the oil fields, regulating its price, regulating its management, fine-tuning its market policies, everything was done by the West. And this is an economy which is completely dependent on Iran, on oil. And you can imagine what would be the extent of political influence when it got translated on the political plane. So you see, and the Mossadegh revolution in 1952, when he was overthrown by the CIA and the MI6 in a joint operation in a coup, it showed, the Western desperation when it appeared that this control was going out of Western hands. So that was in 1952. And then the revolution, we come down to 1979, they reinstalled the Shah's father and the regime, and it continued up to 1979. So, the mainspring of the revolution was actually...
Up to 1979, Iran was part of the US-Pakistan axis, so to speak, and while we were with the Soviet Union and so on.
Absolutely. That's why I was coming to that. So you see, it was playing a certain role. It was part of, the military encirclement of the Soviet Union from the southern flanks, coming up to the Indian border, up to Pakistan, then including Turkey. So you see, this was the arc at that time. So it had, therefore, an impact on India in a certain way. Like, when the wars took place, the Pakistani Air Force could park its planes in Iranian territory. And it gave enormous strategic depth for Pakistan. We couldn't chase those aircraft, So the air power, Pakistan could preserve its air power in a battle with India. So, this is a kind of scenario that was there. They had a very, very pronounced pro-American policy, and India had a non-aligned policy. So all the contradictions ensued out of that. But, business to some extent continued because we needed oil and all that. And at that time also there are limitations because, we didn't have foreign exchange to buy the oil, and nobody would sell then or now, except the Russians perhaps, sell oil for, Indian currency. So, it was difficult at that time beyond a point to expand that relationship. Then the revolution came, and the people who came to power there, this Indians found it very difficult to understand, because then, as today, we have a paranoia about political Islam, and the pan-Islamic movements. This is because of the what you can call Achilles heel or whatever of the Kashmir problem. So it was there it is embedded in the Indian psyche, in the political and security establishment. So the revolutionary fervor actually appeared as a surge of Islam. But very few people understood, in fact, that the revolution was actually carried out by the Fedayeen of the left. And the Tudeh party and the Communist Party, which was in the underground, it supplied the stormtroopers for the revolution. But when they captured power, the clerical establishment came over to the leadership, because the left didn't have that kind of leadership anyway. And then a kind of a reign of terror followed. They eliminated the left from the scene and took over control. Now, this is really, a very succinct presentation of the dynamics of the revolution. So the ideology of the revolution apart, there is the bedrock of the revolution was Iranian nationalism. So from their point of view, when they looked at the neighborhood and the region, they saw India as probably the most valuable partner for them. Because in their scheme of things and their intellectual rendering, India's freedom struggle was very nationalistic. And it was again for, carving out a strategic autonomy for the country. And that is what Iran was also aspiring. So you can see that. But there's a lot of resistance even particularly within the Indian establishment, security establishment, that, that we should look at it in adversarial terms, what has happened in Iran. Then, as now, a lot of Western ideas percolate into our establishment, because, very little original thinking takes place, really speaking, in the Indian establishment, then or now, or I think in ever. So everything is borrowed from the West. So the Western idea that, this was a surge of his militant Islam, this revolution, impressed a lot of Indians. But Indira Gandhi was very open to Ambassador Khalidi's presentation. She called him frequently to Delhi, talked to him privately. At that time, that kind of political culture was in India. And she was also an erudite mind, tremendously experienced in diplomacy. She had no interest in hard diplomacy and all that, but she was quite aware of having been with Panditji, for decades and seeing him handling international diplomacy. So she saw that. And then she just brushed aside the resistance, and she opened a line with the regime, with Imam Khomeini himself, So, this is, so the relationship, I'm coming to that point. The short point is the relationship changed course profoundly from that point. We stopped looking at it because the top-down political culture being what it is in Indira Gandhi's time or even today, when it was understood by the establishment that the leadership wanted a change and a move in this direction, the establishment fell in line. So you see the policy changed thereafter. But on the other hand, Iran took a perspective towards Pakistan in a very curious way, because this revolution also coincided with the Islamization of Pakistan under General Zia. You see, till that time, the virus was not injected into Pakistan till that time, and it was a curious piece of coincidence. And it was perched on militant Sunni Islam. And it manifested as atrocities against on the sectarian lines within Pakistan. Now, this produced a huge revulsion in the Iranian mind, because it was a Shia country. And then Imam Khomeini had a famous coinage for it. He called, that this sort of Islam is actually American Islam. It's a very interesting expression he used, which holds relevance even today. And he was referring to the Gulf countries, Pakistan, and so on. So the relationship with Pakistan dipped, very bad, really went on the downhill slope. And they were, virtually on a very tense relationship it became, from one of fraternal relationship with the Shah's regime. So you see, from that point, if you pick up the threads, the point I'm making is the potentials were enormous for building up this relationship. Once we understood the quintessence of the relationship, and once we also witnessed the hankering for a relationship with India on the part of the Iranians, the soil was fertile. And then we come to the point which you mentioned about, whether it is optimal or not, the relationship. The sad reality is it's not only optimal, it is atrophied. And it had its ups and downs. Like I would put a benchmark that it continued that trend that Indira Gandhi, the gateway that Indira Gandhi opened, continued almost up to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, because as a foreign minister and otherwise, he had an interest in these matters. And he was a genuine nationalist, an unvarnished nationalist. But it really continued up to Rao's time, because Rao's difference was that, Narasimha Rao's difference is that he was one of the most erudite prime ministers of India. And he was a scholar. He was a linguist. And, what better way to understand a country than, knowing the language of that is spoken in that country. So I have worked at that time as the head of the Pakistan division in the ministry later. And then I saw, his approach to, for instance, during the 1992 Babri Masjid incident, after the communal riots broke out here. And there was a lot of vandalism in Bombay and so on against, Hindu establishments and so on. And there's a big upsurge of Hindu fervor in the country. And Iran spoke very, very, very bluntly about, what was going on in India. So this is, towards the end of 92. And I'll tell you, in the foreign ministry at that time, when I was heading the division and Mr. Dikshit was the foreign secretary, we had a note from the Prime Minister's office requiring us to arrange a visit for Rao to Iran. Now, frankly speaking, we were stunned, in the sense that it was just not the propitious moment to do that. But I'm just mentioning, that some of us do not really realize what an erudite mind he had. And that is what is lacking today. In terms of a country like Iran, we need to have a very erudite mind applying itself diligently, because it is a country which has a sense of purpose, which has a national ideology and a profound history, and is a civilization state with huge ambitions of becoming a global power by its processes of development and expanding deepening its strategic autonomy. This is what Iran is.
What happened after Mr. Vajpayee's tenure?
after Mr. Bajpayee's time, here came Chandrasekhar, Subramaniam Swamy, and others, handling foreign affairs. You can imagine where it landed. So, then after that, Manmohan Singh's time, the priority was in terms of neoliberal policies, Washington consensus, and so on. So then again, it got relegated to the backdrop. You see, the negative factors there working on us has been primarily the American factor. The Americans, could never reconcile with Iran after the hostage crisis. And the hostility is very deeply embedded. And it is also in relation to America's sponsorship of Israel as the charioteer of Western interests in that region. And Iran is antithetical. So, the Americans have a very serious problem with Iran. And occasional writings show that, that there is a possibility of a fresh thinking. But then now I don't see that happening at all, because between Biden and Trump, I don't see that happening at all. So the American factor is very important. And then in the early 90s, in Narasimha Rao's time, another thing happened also for us, which was normalizing with Israel. And for Israel, Iran is at that time, it was already so important for them that they used to come and plant, disinformation with us constantly. I used to regularly meet the Israeli ambassador at that time. And, at that time, one of the things that they spread, and which actually took roots in the Indian establishment, security establishment, and the agencies, the premier agency in India for external intelligence, said Iran was developing a bomb. And I had a massive argument at that time in 92, 93, that this is baloney. If you really understand, if you really work on Iran in a serious professional way, you could see that Iran doesn't have the industrial and technological base to do it, nor the political will, given the Imam's fatwa against bomb, which is, a very important red line for Iran. It will never cross that. And even today, it holds good. But they planted this idea. So, Israel, American Axis worked on it. And at that time, one of the visits that, we had to Iran, they requested us, the Israelis requested us, I'm speaking about 1993, requested us to make an intervention with them about the bomb. Of course, we didn't, because we knew that it was not completely unwarranted. It was none of our business to get into this, and we didn't do that. So you see, the interference continued from that time. But then you see what happened is the Israelis, once they get into a tent, it is like the camel in the tent, they just push very hard, because they have very few external relations. And when they find a conducive atmosphere, and the Indian media largely could be cultivated by the Israelis for whatever reasons, one doesn't know how it has happened, arranging journalists to go there and so on and so forth. So you see, the Israeli part profoundly influenced. It is not that it is just propagandistic, it also had substance, because Israel has weapon systems which are useful for India. And it was a relationship mostly in regard of our adversarial ties with Pakistan. Whatever Israel could give at that time, and it also is ultimately, though we pretend that China is the big enemy and all that, Indians are obsessed with Pakistan, the Indian establishment. It cannot get rid of it. Even a small thing that you do, finally you find, the people mocking at Pakistan and all this kind of things, and it's a schadenfreude, that any bad tidings from Pakistan gives you a sense of joy here. All that is part of our national psyche, unfortunately. So or the establishment, so to speak. But, therefore, this axis has created havoc. It has interfered in the progression of India-Iran relationship. And this is a security angle is there. And then now lately, one can almost sense it, though I don't have any empirical evidence or anything. I can also see that, this Pegasus and all this is brought to the fore, that Israel has a certain expertise, an expertise in political assassinations, in subverting regimes, in distorting, viewpoints and strategic assessment, strategic thinking, hijacking strategic thinking. all that kind of thing. Now, it has developed, rightly so, because it's a small country in a very hostile environment. And it has developed expertise, niche expertise in certain areas. Now, any or many or all of this expertise could be of relevance to certain other countries. And how far India has used it, I really don't know, how far India has used it. But I would imagine that India had use for it, and the Israelis offered it, and the Pegasus brought to the fore also that, this sort of expertise is invaluable for any kind of establishment in a foreign country which doesn't have that expertise. So that becomes a particularly important factor because it is a subterranean factor also. It is seldom discussed except when a scam breaks out. It is never discussed in the public domain. So, therefore, its potency is all the more greater, though even in a democratic society, these things can get discussed, but they don't get discussed because they are all taking place smoke and mirrors, So you don't discuss them.
You've spoken about how the relations with Iran have atrophied, and you've spoken about the Israel factor and the US factor. But two things in this regard, Mr. Kumar. One is, of course, has this atrophying or whatever, how did the American sanctions affect this? Because that seems to have had an impact on our energy purchases from Iran. And secondly, in recent times, there have been some positive developments, such as this visa-free arrival for Indians and Iran getting into BRICS thanks to India. Can you talk a little about how you contextualize these three aspects?
Yeah, actually, the turning point came. All these passions were building up, negative passions were building up, and the turning point came in the Indian vote at the IAEA against Iran. To my mind, it was completely unwarranted. We could have stayed off. And there was even an element of hypocrisy in our voting on that because, we had become a nuclear power by that time. And given our long experience in clandestine operations and our own nuclear aspirations, it was doublespeak on the part of India to, take to the heights and, speak in moral terms. But, we did that. And that really stunned the Iranians. And that was the turning point. And I think
this was in which year?
This was in 2005. I could see, because I read Iranian press very regularly, I could see that, that made them think that the India that was there, that romantic notion of India in terms of the freedom struggle and, the nationalism of Nehru and Indira Gandhi and all that is a thing of the past. That since the 90s, the relationship was changed. And after Narasimha Rao, relationship was changing profoundly. And this came as a shock to them, really. And they could see then that they have to have a pragmatic relationship with India to the extent that is necessary. Because that also forced them, despite the huge backlog of their relationship with the Soviet Union, which was very tense and unfriendly, because the Russians had Chechnya and all that kind of thing, and they viewed Iran with great suspicion because of the Iranian support for this sort of political Islam. But they began making it with the Russians, they're making it with the Chinese, etc. Then you can see that the Iranians began diversifying their interests. And that is a factor there also. As far as the sanctions are concerned, Iranians took the line that ways and means could have been found because the Americans were really not sanctioning any country collaterally, a third country collaterally, for breaking their sanction. Because at that time, the Americans were not even capable of doing that. Even today, they are not capable of doing that. But India did not make any effort, sincere efforts, because we, in fact, resorted to sophistry. We pleaded that the sanctions were coming in the way, but at the same time, as votaries of the Washington Consensus, we didn't want this relationship to go. I'm being very frank about it. So, the point is, therefore, I narrated this past to tell you that much of the blame lies with the Indian leadership. It was incapable of understanding that it no longer cared to understand the impulses of the Islamic Revolution, the desire on the part of the Iranians to have a tremendously strong relationship with India as two countries, two poles in the region of South Asia and West Asia, which put primacy on strategic autonomy as at the very core of their foreign policy. And strategic autonomy and non-alignment and all that kind of thing also got eroded in India. Meanwhile, so you see the turning point came at that time around within the last couple of decades. And it was never the same. I could see the relationship was never the same. So when you come to Chabahar and all that, this is really where the informed opinion in India is not there. There's no informed opinion here. So this is in terms of showing faces at Pakistan. But Chabahar is not a viable option for building up a relationship with Afghanistan and Central Asia, and that has to be done only. It can be done best only with Pakistan, through Pakistan. It has been so in the past, and it is so even now. And therefore, what we did is we established a presence there, and then Kulbhushan Yadav and all came, and it muddied the relationship with Pakistan, and Iranians also got a bad name out of it after he was nabbed by the ISI. So then what did they do? They offered to Pakistan that, if you have a suspicion like this, we are not party to any kind of subversive activities against you. Why don't you also come and, establish your presence in Chabahar? And the Chinese were, of course, tremendously interested because, Pakistan is part of the BRI, Iran is part of the BRI, and as many portheads as possible opening into the Indian Ocean is important to them because, of their interest in Africa and West Asia and all that. And, the more the merrier. So the Chinese offered that they could put more money. Indians put, as the North Indians say, naam ke vaste, something, for sending, a shipload of wheat or some such thing. But, the potential of Chabahar was never exploited. And it is languishing. And even, in terms of, putting a crane there for operating the port, because I am of the view that, probably the Americans have always been keeping an eye on Chabahar and didn't want a kind of a strategic port to open there, which would give Iran a lot of strategic depth, if it got to be used as a vital artery connecting Central Asia and Russia with the Indian Ocean, So they didn't want that probably. So, we did it for namesake. Every time a prime minister or a foreign minister would go there, would mention Chabahar. And the Indian media would immediately get excited, Chabahar. But if you really want to get excited, you must get excited with the control of Haifa port by management of Haifa port by Adani. Now that is really where there is a strategic presence. I don't think in Chabahar there is anything really happening. And now in the last visit...
But hasn't India invested almost close to $1 billion in Chabahar?
This is what I'm saying. The ill-informed Indian opinion has, formed opinions, came to conclusions which are completely unwarranted by ground reality. We put $50 million compared to around $1 billion by Adani Group in Haifa. So you can imagine, you just see the scale, and all this.
And what is the scale of investment of other countries in Chabahar? Like if we put 50, what about the Chinese? And so is it more or is it less?
The focus is in Iran. Chabahar is in the eastern area. And it is a very, very underdeveloped area. So the Chabahar port's development is of interest to the Iranians in terms of the economic development of that region, of their part of Baluchistan, where there is also an insurgency in Iran. But, the main port head is Bandar Abbas. And now this north-south corridor, which is coming from Russia, and the Iranians are also pushing very hard for it, which is their number one priority. It is connecting Bandar Abbas. And then from there, this Vizhinjam port in Kerala, you can take it to the smaller ports and on the coastlines. And, so Iran's needs are met with, but at the same time, it is really in terms of regional connectivity, it is a mega project. Now, there again, you see the Indian approach. The Indian approach is, that we voice support for the north-south international corridor, but we haven't put a pie on it. And it is left to the Russians and the Iranians to create that thing. And when it comes there, if it generates business, why not? We will use it also. And it is also the same fate, with the Chennai-Vladivostok ceiling. And how many times your paper has written about it? I'm sure. But where does
We
it...
haven't, so Chabahar does not have any strategic geopolitical importance or a larger like
Chabahar
economic
has an
importance.
importance. Chabahar has an importance because it is a highly sensitive area for Iran, because there is a certain kind of insurgency taking place there. And it is also contiguous to the Pakistani part of Balochistan. So powers which are interested, in fact, the militant groups which are operating in that area, Chabahar area and the Pakistani part of Balochistan, they had very big Saudi funding, and they were backed politically and militarily by the CIA and the MI6 operating out of Afghanistan. So this is actually the plain truth. Now the Saudis, after this rapprochement, they have given in fact, the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran is based on this understanding that neither side will interfere in the other country's internal affairs. And, time and again, they have made this error, that when we professed, that this would be a profound strategic link for India and all this kind of thing. They thought that they were bonding with India. And they're bonding with India in a big game, and this is exactly, this is consistent with the Iranian thinking all along, that as a country with a strategic autonomy, and it, in fact, even signaled a possibility that, India will distance itself from the US and will not be unduly influenced by the US and Israel to develop a relationship. Now, you see, one curious factor here is, unlike Israel and the US, Iran has never really drawn a line for India on account of India's relationship with the US and Israel. It's a very, 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 very curious situation, and it is symptomatic of the kind of pragmatism and the nimbleness of the Persian sensibility. It's only possible for a country, a civilization state like that to, we claim civilization state, but I don't buy it. But a civilization state like Iran, it comes naturally. And therefore, they would have gone along with India to any extent and walked into the night with India to the extent that India wanted, and they would have been delighted with that. So what they had in mind was, in fact, that this involvement with Chabahar will mean also that India will be willy-nilly, sooner rather than later, also lend a hand in developing a rail link north-south, going up to the Central Asian border, to the Turkmenistan border. There is a city called Zahedan near Chabahar. Now, Zahedan is a place where India has all along had a consulate, because it's a very good listening post on Pakistan. So, it has always been there, and it is, like it's our J&K, it's a place, completely in the middle of the insurgency. You can eavesdrop on a number of areas from there. So the line from Chabahar would have gone to Zahedan, and from Zahedan it would have run north all along the Pakistani border. And Iranians thought Indians would be interested and go right up to their northern border, which can connect with Turkmenistan and the old Soviet link in the Central Asian region, the rail grid, and could even have potentially moved further up along the Volga to the Russian heartland itself. But we dragged our feet. And this actually was proposed to us during Manmohan Singh's time, and by none other than that, one of the best strategic thinkers of Iran in their foreign policy establishment, Velayati. One of visit by Velayati, and if I remember correctly, I was in the Iran desk at that time. If I remember correctly, it was somewhere in the late 80s. And it's a joint commission meeting. He suddenly floated this idea of India having, Chabahar and all this kind of thing. But we didn't proceed at all with that. And it became a pipe dream for the Iranians, So when I say interest in terms of regional connectivity, and, at that time, I will not mention, there was a very powerful Indian company. It's even now there, a corporate group, which had profound dealings with Shah and was very influential, therefore well connected in Iran. It even offered that it would take in hand this railway project. And it had the resources based in London to arrange even capital for it. But we didn't take it because every time we come into a project, the Americans are eavesdropping and they would know what's going on. And they got the sense that Indians are going to get into this. Because what they didn't want is a kind of an alignment between India and Iran in our region, which should be very detrimental to the furtherance of American interests in the region. Period. It's simple as that. It languished. So the Iranian dream became a pipe dream. And what we have done now is that we use it for sending, to show the middle finger at the Pakistanis. We send now and then a ship full of wheat, surplus wheat in our stockpiles, in our FCI godowns, and send it up north and into Afghanistan. And immediately the media gets excited that the Chabahar route has come alive and India is connecting with Afghanistan in a major way. There's no big trade taking place in Afghanistan today, as you know well. So it's only for sending relief supplies that we are using it. And for that purpose, Iranians don't mind. To whatever extent it is being used is a good thing. And Central Asians also know that that there is a route that is existing like that, but they also haven't used because they are smart enough to know also that it doesn't have that kind of a future in immediate terms. This is the story of Chabahar.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar Daman. That really explains with a great deal of depth what actually is the situation there. And there seems to be a lot of potential here which India has not really tapped into. Now, the other two aspects which has gotten a lot of play in media reports is, of course, this Iran's initiative in offering us visa-free arrival and India's role in getting Iran into BRICS. What kind of significance would you read into these two developments, especially Iran's presence in BRICS, because it has been excluded and cut off in general with the sanctions and so on. So, is this going to make a big difference to Iran and to India as well?
This Iran opening up is a phenomenon which began during Rouhani's time. From the position of a national security state, besieged by the Americans, they began to get confidence, and with the nuclear deal and so on, they had virtually broken out of the sanctions ring that the Americans had put around them, and had a masterly knowledge of circumventing the sanctions and getting their things done. And contrary to the Western opinion, the Iranian economy is not on the brink of collapse. I have heard the story at least for the last 30 years that Iran's economy is about to explode. It didn't happen, and it is not happening, and it will not happen. And they had their ways of circumventing the sanctions. So the nuclear deal, in fact, there are, like in any other democratic country, you must understand that it's not a one-dimensional foreign policy. It is a multidimensional thing, because the foreign policy process making that is again something which we do not understand it. Unlike in India, where at the PMO a meeting takes place, an interdepartmental meeting takes place, and the big decision is arrived at, and then the decision makers' thinking percolates as policy. That's not how it happens in Iran. In Iran, what happens is that that there are a number of agencies, a number of nodal points, in the thing, and the Shia political culture is also that it is eclectic and it is also very quarrelsome, and then they cogitate and they arrive at thinking, and it then, of course, get the imprimatur of the supreme leader for the final word, who has the final word on it, and it becomes policy. But even then in Iran, unlike in India, from within the establishment, people keep sniping at it. They don't necessarily fall in line in that way as it happens in India. The possibilities of subversion is still there. But what I'm saying is, during the nuclear deal time, this aspect came to the fore, that Iran must diversify its relationship. And therefore, they opened up on the visa front and so on and so forth. I'm just making a point here that the visa-free travel facilities given to India is consistent with their deep interest in promoting relations with India, especially people-to-people relationship, which is very important for them, for people to travel to Iran from India. And without the security establishment putting impediments in terms of, what religion they are of, and so on and so forth. So that is one aspect of it. And then they genuinely want to develop a relationship with India. So it's very easy to see. It's not a special gesture towards India, in other words. I'll turn to the BRICS. As far as the BRICS is concerned, I really don't know how you got the impression that India promoted Iran's BRICS membership, or India sponsored. It is thanks to India that Iran got that membership. It's not really so. It's far from the truth. India fell in line, and India did not oppose the consensus that was building up within the BRICS for Iran's membership. The pioneering role was that of Russia. It was not even of China. It was pioneering role of Russia. Because you see why it is so. Because I mentioned to you, Iran is a country which has gone through this bitter experience of decades of American sanctions, and has not only lived and thrived, and is able to, in fact, even develop itself technologically to very, very sublime heights, that it can make its own satellites, spy satellites, ballistic missiles, whatnot. So it means that it could acquire very high levels of mathematics, physics, and whatever is needed for this sort of development. Drone, for instance, is a major drone power, global power today. So you see, Iran is therefore understood very differently by other countries. In India only, we think, that everything begins and ends with Israel. But Israel, really speaking, is not the power of the future in the world of tomorrow, in that region. Russians understood it. And then their knowledge of, handling the American sanctions, that expertise is very useful for Russia. And we come across the reports that the Russians have begun using Iranian weapon systems in a major way. And therefore, you see, across the board, in these conditions of sanctions, a special affinity came to exist between Russia and Iran. Now, not only that, there is also, even though it is not widely known, and it is also difficult to explain, but easy to explain if you understand these two countries properly, is that there is a personal understanding also between President Putin and Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, I really don't know what is the basis of this personal affinity. There have been some reports that appeared. In fact, decades ago, I had come across that report that Khamenei in his youth had been a product of the Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow. I really don't know. I searched and searched in the internet, but I couldn't find any further thing about it. And unfortunately, I didn't keep that evidence also in my archives. But it is embedded in my memory. Now, therefore, it is quite possible that Ayatollah Khamenei has an understanding of the Soviet Union and Russia, which is rather extraordinary. And Russia's policy and Putin's visit, the body languages, if every time Putin came, I saw the body language between them. It was electrifying. And, that is a factor in that relationship. So all this taken into account, Russia felt that, the BRICS, which was a Russian project, just as Shanghai Cooperation Organization was a Chinese project, in the conditions of sanctions, it is important that Iran becomes a member. Because, up until now, up until last year, the BRICS was actually languishing. But now you have suddenly seen that it has bested itself and has come to the fore as one of the main platforms of Russian foreign policy. And in fact, it has arrived on the global stage with 34 countries now queuing up for membership of BRICS. Its prestige is soaring, and it is also going corresponding to the decline of the G7. So you see, its emergence as a counterpoint to the G7 in a way that it will overtake the G7 very shortly if it isn't already. And it rallies the non-Western world, and it is representing the voice of the global majority. All these things makes BRICS very important for Russia. China was not in it to this extent before, but China has sensed the potentials of it. And surely enough, China is fully backing it now, because China sees that, what the Russians pioneered was with a vision. And that vision's fulfillment is today possible, and is more than that, is an imperative need in the new world order. So China is also part of it. So this axis has helped Iran to get into it, to BRICS. And the Russians really speeded up the membership, cutting corners and speeded up the relationship. But then, of course, they have given also at the same time a different coloring to it in terms of the BRICS' future dimensions by getting on board certain other countries. In fact, the focus is on the Middle East, and powerful relationships, traditional relationships like with Egypt, one of the most important relationships, in fact, the Soviets had in the Middle East with Egypt. It has got resuscitated in the recent years. And Russians have always understood that, this period of decline apart, it is really a heavyweight in Middle East politics, and it's useful and necessary to have it in board. So that is there. Saudi Arabia, for obvious reasons, and but I don't think Saudi Arabia is really speaking a genuine BRICS member country. I don't think so. This is my personal assessment. But pragmatic reasons, Saudis need it also because it helps them to push back the American pressure. UAE is in it for greater reasons because UAE has become a hub of Russian business activity, again in the conditions under sanctions, on which account UAE has come under pressure from the Americans and also from this UN agency in Paris on money laundering and so on. So you see, these are the countries which have gone in along with Iran, but so that Iran also doesn't stick out like a sore thumb. That this is a militant platform, anti-Western platform. This kind of general spreading, the Russians and the Chinese have concluded, is good for the image, and I think it is rightly so, as these 34 members lining up now shows. So that is the story of Iran, and Iran's presence in the BRICS will definitely galvanize the change, even the alchemy of the BRICS, because Iran is a genuine believer in the ideology of BRICS, the ideology that Russia had in mind when it conceived it, slightly ahead of time, but foreseeing that the turn of events is going to be in such a direction that a platform of this nature is needed. Now, unless this process is understood, we will not be able to judge the process leading to Iran's membership, its future potentials to transform the BRICS, etc. Now, I don't think that India has ever been, except for short periods of time perhaps, for pragmatic reasons, been a great believer in BRICS. I feel that the last time we held the summit also, I felt that India feels very uncomfortable with BRICS. This is like a moth-eaten platform. This is not the kind of crowd with which India would want to associate. A membership or a permanent invitation to G7 would thrill India, the Indian elite, but not BRICS. Now you can find even from the Indian media, very little gets written about. It's only in the recent past, with the BRICS coming to the fore like this, that there's been a higher degree of interest in the Indian media in writing about BRICS. It's not there otherwise. So you see, India's, because we pick up vibes from the Indian elite. And they know that BRICS is a low priority. So India sponsoring Iran's membership, helping Iran to get on board BRICS, I think it is really far-fetched.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Kumar. I really enjoyed your really fascinating perspective on BRICS and how Iran and Russia, how they are approaching the entire formation. I know it's getting late for you. So one last question, quick question before I let you go. So in the context of all that we've discussed so far, and India has had to do some kind of a, not very successful so far, but some kind of a balancing act between the Western interests in India's relations with Iran and India's own goal of strategic autonomy, which is still very much there on the table, or so one would like to believe. So, what is the kind of future roadmap for India-Iran relations that one could envisage if you want to take it out of this atrophied status that you've spoken about?
You see, the unknown is about the American policy towards Iran. Now we are right in this is an inflection point. Is there going to be an attack on Iran? Is there going to be a war to destroy Iran and bring it to the level of Iraq and Syria and Egypt? That is a very big point. So, we are now groping in the dark when we discuss this aspect. Because coming to India, one good thing about India is India always wants to be with the winning side. And it's not because of the right side of history or anything like that, but India just is a very pragmatic country. So if Iran proceeds at this pace and in this direction to build itself up as a regional power with huge global influence, India will play ball with Iran. That is my conviction and my firm belief. India will do that because India knows ultimately what is good for itself. And second aspect is, if the American decline continues on this track, and I think it is, as a student of history and otherwise of geopolitics, I think it is inevitable. And we are probably somewhere near the end of it, the American global hegemony. And as far as the regional politics is concerned, this diplomatic recognition that China has given to the Taliban shows that regional states taking their own initiatives and charioting their own future, which began as a phenomenon in the Gulf region already, and that is spreading, and that is coming to Central Asia and this kind of situation, Taliban situation, and so on. So you see, India changed tack. Can't you see that? Through the periods of the Western occupation of Afghanistan, India played ball with the Americans, and their military commanders were frequently in Delhi to consult us and to work with us, and we were very happy to give them the help. And we never were inclined to see the Taliban in its real terms, which was a resistance movement. I kept on writing. If you look at my writings, you will see that. I kept on writing that it is quintessentially a resistance movement and it cannot be defeated. And we must come to terms with it. Now we have not only come to terms with it, we are eagerly wanting to be a part of the regional processes for the stabilization of the Taliban government in Kabul. Now, this is a very good thing about India, that once it knows that the other track is drying up, switching over to a different track comes very easy to the Indian elite. We'll do that. So I don't think that this narrative which I gave about the chronicle of India-Iran relationship reaching an atrophied point today is going to be for all time. I'm cautiously optimistic, unless the Americans and the Israelis really go ahead and bring Iran also down to the level of Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, which is the only way now that Israel's regional dominance can be re-established in West Asia.
Right, that is definitely an unknown, Mr. Kumar, as you rightly pointed out. And yes, and one can, I think, end on a note of cautious optimism with regard to India-Iran relations. Thank you so much once again for joining us, Mr. Kumar. It was absolutely a fascinating conversation, so much to learn, really insightful observations as well. Absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.